Patch 3.19 is probably one of my favorite patches to date. It buffs some completely forgotten cards, shattered Seraphine's kneecaps, but most important of all, the rally nerfs. Sure, 4-mana Tumble is still playable, but Vayne is from Demacia, a notoriously elitist and racist region in Runeterra, and racists don't deserve rights. The nerf button isn't enough, Riot. I want her dead. All jokes aside, the biggest nerf came to Seraphine, whose prevalence made playing against her miserable unless you decided to play Vayne decks, which is the equivalent of being asked, would you rather get stung by 10 bees in random places across your body within the space of 10 minutes, or get stung by 1 bee on the inside of your mouth? I chose the nuclear option. Now with Seraphine gone though, there's a combo deck that went slightly under the radar this last patch that I think has a lot of potential. The deck, of course, that I'm talking about is the triple champion lineup of Nami, Fizz, and Varus, which I've decided to nickname Saltwater Cultists. Last patch, this deck saw some competitive play in high-level tournaments, but was almost never seen on ladder despite its supposedly decent win rate. I was initially made aware of this list through content creator Aikado, who I have entirely stolen this deck from, and further convinced of its power through Majin Bay. The idea of this deck is simple: elusive spam with Nami buffs. Oh, well, I guess I could explain a little more. Unlike previous Nami decks, the main star of this deck isn't actually Nami, since her nerf made her an alright champion. The attack power that she provides is definitely valuable, but the real stars are Shelly, Burblefish, and Coral creatures. The latter two cards create 1-mana spells from our regions, which in our case is heavily restricted to Bilgewater and the cultist 1-mana card pool. This means that there are only 11 cards in total that we can hit, which include Momentous Choice and the Bilgewater Tellstones. Among these options are several burst speed spells which work with Nami on board pretty easily and keep our Fizz safe for elusive swings. Shelly also likes these low-cost spells as it allows him to buff the board more regularly, and at this point I think you can see the game plan. Last patch, this didn't work out so well because of how efficient Seraphine Ezreal was at removing her units, while we generally lack unit removal ourselves outside of violent discord. This patch though? Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say I felt at least a little hopeful. My journey began against, hey, wait a minute, wasn't this deck supposed to be nerfed? The one deck that I was genuinely not expecting to see on my first game out was Seraphine Ezreal, but this time I felt like the odds were a little more stacked against me compared to the control deck that I was playing before. Nevertheless, here's how this game played out. At the start of the match, I played the Dark and Harpoon on my Coral creatures, hoping to bait out some removal spells that could otherwise go into more important targets, and, well, you know what they say about me, I am a master at baiting. Wait, no, I was so excited to have an elusive unit on board later on that I equipped the wrong target and could have easily pushed for more damage if I gave it to the Coral creatures here, and I played with the NA mindset for the rest of the match. If they have it, they have it. The fan club president came back with a vengeance for this match. The first one generated a Celestial Wonder which stymied one of my attacks. It's almost as if the unit generating a 2-mana spell in exchange for nothing from an incredibly impactful pool of spells is the reason why this card is strong and not its inherent mana cost. And even though it's always inevitable, Nami leveled a few minutes later and provided me with a pretty decent board threat. I swung with all of my units because that's what you need to do against some of these combo decks, used the Bilgewater Tellstones that I got off of one of my units to rally, and instead of denying the rally, my opponent thought it was better to kill the Burblefish. I mean, yeah, I guess if you want to prevent damage, but after this whole cacophony of spells, I still managed to punch him with Shelly while my opponent had 0 mana. I tried to swing with the 1 copy of Varus later in the game and lost him to the 3rd Ravenous Flock, and then the back alley Barkeep generated Scorched Earth to kill my Nami. Yes, we're in the region that Scorched Earth is in, and I had a second Nami in hand, but back alley Bar can quite literally generate anything, and it generated the perfect answer to my champion. This is what I sound like when I'm having fun. I misplayed pretty heavily later into the match by developing Fizz and then using our only spell in hand to give him elusive. I was trying to get as much damage on board as possible because I knew that we would be losing against this deck with our current hand size. In response, my opponent played a Song Spinner with a leveled Seraphine on board, and my heart sank. This, combined with a second fan club president on board, meant that my opponent now had 3 spells in hand that cost 0 mana and a 5 mana spell that was set to 2 mana. That counts 4 spells in total, all of which could spell disaster for me, could be copied by Seraphine, and all of which I had zero idea what they actually were. At this point, I was desperate, and in order to quell the evil before me, I had to call upon my ancient enemy. I received Ransom Riches early in the match from Coral Creatures, which generated Tiana Crown Guard. In my desperation, I played it with my decently statted elusive board, but surely with 4 spells in hand that they surrendered? Nobody learns of this. As far as the YouTube audience is concerned, I still hate you. We quickly moved on from combo to aggro, and I had a really poor start against this deck. My opponent had a great 1-drop into a 2-drop into another 2-drop that quickly set me on the back foot, and thanks to the barrel on board, I was strangely worried about Death Lotus or partly removing my units. The cultist cards are unbelievably strong though, as I denied the Swain level up with a 2-mana burst spell from the region. My opponent fired a Scorched Earth at the same Coral Creatures, but come on man, that's just petty. It doesn't even level Swain. Of course, Swain did level up, but I wasn't concerned because I had Unforgiving Cold to deny lethal, almost freely traded my opponent's entire board down, then swung back with myself to win Game 2. How did this happen, you ask? Game 3 was an immediate wash. I queued in a Jinx Scion discard aggro, had a decent hand that I threw away for an objectively awful one. My opponent hit me with a casual 6 damage on turn 2 because I had nothing to respond with, and I surrendered after Unending Wave found nothing useful. Game 4 was, poetically, versus Jin Annie, and I'm starting to see a certain pattern with these opponents taking advantage of the latter the day after a patch. I swear to God, I will break out the control list. I will do it. I don't mean to be rude to any of my opponents, but playing burn decks on the day after a patch is like giving your child a premium membership to TurboTax on their birthday. Here, son, it's time you learned about the harsh realities of the world and how 3 things are inevitable in life: death, taxes, and people playing Noxus burn lists on patch day.
Dad, I'm 7.
My opponent also seemed to not fully understand the meaning of tempo, as they didn't swing with either of the Crackshot Corsairs when it was obvious that I was going to block the highest damage unit with my Coral Creatures. And heck, I was even forced to develop Nami pretty soon after to block even more damage since I knew that this deck wouldn't give me time to breathe. A few minutes later, while I was at 9 HP, a Fervor wasn't thrown at my face, but rather at my unleveled Nami, who wasn't even threatening lethal at the time. With only 2 cards in hand, they threw an open attack again for a guaranteed 2 damage, which I thought meant for sure that they had another Fervor, but they handed over the win instead. Let's break this down even further. After the final attack, I was at 7 HP. If my opponent swung with the Crackshot Corsairs in round 2, that's 2 extra points of damage, knocking me down to 5 HP here instead. Then, if Fervor was thrown at my face instead of an unleveled Nami, I would have taken 3 more and been at 2 HP. This means that if my opponent found a second Fervor or had a Decimate following this final attack since they had 8 mana left over, I would have been utterly powerless to stop it and lost the game then and there. Lesson of the day is that if you're playing Noxus Burn, don't play like you just net decked the list off of Mobalytics. Ugh, this annoys me way more than it should. 5th and final game of the first recording session was accompanied once again by these 2. God dang it, dude. Who are you people? Fortunately for me, my opponent was very eager to throw away an Ezreal early into the match and also didn't understand how Fizz works. I also managed to get Nami on board following a draw from Unending Wave. Remember, Shelly is the star of the deck, not Nami. Most people will see red when they see this champion hit the board, and she becomes prime removal bait. I was surprised to see Nami take a Mystic Shot early on, but even with 1 mana left in stock, there was never a Flock to follow up. Seraphine showed up and created a Make It Rain in hand, which helped level the Ezreal extremely quickly if they ever had a chance to find him. And from this point forward, several things went in my favor. Thanks to Darkened Harpoon on Nami, she was now an attacking powerhouse. Thanks to the Expanse's protection, I was able to keep Nami on board later down the line following a Static Shock. Thanks to the lack of Ravenous Flock in my opponent's hand and the early waste of removal on Fizz, Shelly never suffered any removal himself. Thanks once again to Darken Harpoon, I had 2x Violent Discord activated in hand, which counted for 4 casts with Nami and Shelly on board. That's 4 mana, plus 10 attack, and plus 2 HP, and I got to remove Seraphine from the board. I shudder when I think of what this deck might have been if Nami was never nerfed. Song Spinner was played later in the game when I was swinging for lethal, despite my opponent being caught unaware of the combo that I held in hand. Miraculously, they found Sumpworks map and Legionary Charge off of the Song Spinner, which they used to try and block Shelly, but I knew that I had lethal regardless, thanks once again to Unforgiving Cold. The last card from Song Spinner was Guiding Touch, which they used on their unit since I was going for an OTK, and it wouldn't have made a difference on their Nexus. And since they didn't find anything of use, they surrendered immediately afterwards, putting our session win rate at 4-1. I went to bed that night, satisfied with my results, but my sleep was haunted. Was I doing well because I found an off-meta deck that nobody knew how to play against, or was I becoming the villain that I always feared I would be? I mean, yeah, in game 1 we might have rallied twice in the match, a mechanic that I hate myself, but it was for a good cause, right? And Nami was nerfed, so it's not like this deck was actually meta-defining, plus we're playing it in gold. Surely things would correct themselves once I got into higher elo, right? Maybe I'd even be able to play my favorite decks again. Well, one can dream, can't they? In between the last recording session and the current one, I ran some games over on my stream at twitch.tv/sojournerkai_ because someone else took the username before I did, and pushed a little further into gold. I played 10 games of this list, which I found through Runeterra AR user Malagossi, and I went 8-4 with it. It's a Bilgewater burn deck that likes to disguise itself as a control deck with its champion choices, and it's pretty fun in my opinion. I might even do a video on this one later. Then I also played 3 games of Ziggs Talia, going 2-for-1 on ladder with it as well. In between this, I also tried messing around with some terrible Howling Abyss decks and normals suggested by viewers of the stream that were genuinely a lot of fun, but I'll let these deck list images speak for themselves. And that leads us to the second day of recording, where Platinum rank was surely within the grasp of the saltwater cultist, so long as I didn't run into any decks that had heavier removal and largely featured Nox. Oh, for fuck's sake. I'll be honest, I was not paying attention to this match. My game crashed partway through the loading screen when I saw the region lineup. I panicked and made a mulligan for MF Swain. Turns out, this deck was Annie, Katarina, Twisted Fate. Full-on skill spamming Noxus burn, and I was very poorly equipped to deal with it. Funny enough, I was able to get a fairly wide elusive board, but the problem was that my opponent had stuns and removal for days. Even if I wanted to swing for any amount of damage, it wasn't physically possible to the levels that I wanted to. I did manage to remove a copy of Annie and Katarina somehow, but I misclicked on the wrong Arachnoid Sentry here, and it was the catalyst that caused the game to spiral out of control for me. I misplayed even more later when I tried to swing with Varus and neglected to play literally anything to push for lethal damage here. If I played a unit, my board would have been too wide for my opponent to handle. If I played a spell, my leveled Varus would have used the Darken Bow to push for the last point of damage that I needed. Fortunately, my opponent was down to just 1 card in hand, though, and all I needed was the chance to develop the Spey Folk that I got from Mare, which I received in turn from Ransom Riches that was generated by Coral Creatures, and then swing back for lethal with impact damage or elusive damage. They opted in for an open attack on their following turn, and as it happened, their last card was Riptide Rex. Like I said though, I simply wasn't paying much attention to this game and was made to suffer for it. Totally winnable if my brain was a little more than some copper wire and LEDs stuck in a leftover bowl of cream of wheat. The next match was against a deck that I hadn't tested before, Lurk. I knew that we had the units that could trade up easily enough, but was worried in regards to what that meant for our late game plan. If I have no units and my opponent has been hitting Lurk consistently, then basically anything they play can become lethal. Surprisingly, I managed to keep up with the high tempo that Lurk demands and even managed to remove a Pike later down the road with none other than the most broken card in this deck, Unforgiving Cold. Consistently, one of my favorite things about this deck is how much bait the champions are. Fizz can't be targeted, Varus is only here because the cultist cards are good, and Nami is already winning games if played at the right time. Therefore, my adversary removed Varus when I played him early on, and it didn't change much about the outcome of the match. I received the scout keyword from the Piltover Castaway. Lurk McGee said, hey, that should go on an elusive unit, to which I gladly obliged and put it on Fizz. And thanks to the buffs from my units and the lack of Quicksand or Ruthless Predator, or the fact that they spent their hammer snouts removing my Varus, I swung for an exact OTK on turn 7 and never looked back. Whoa, hey, come on now. I still hate Demacia and free attacks from the region. Besides, I was incredibly lucky to hit Scout out of the Weapon Master pool, so it's not like I'm abusing the mechanics, I'm just using the ones that have been given to me. I ran to someone else in my elo playing Swain Senna Control, which I knew I would need to bank mana early so that I could appropriately spread out buffs to my units. My hand felt a little awkward early on, and I had to drop an unleveled Nami much earlier than I would have liked. Fortunately for me, my opponent seemed so confident that I wouldn't block their Swain that they swung on the turn that they dropped him, and I gladly spent 1 mana to block and kill him. Fizz may be a good card in this deck, but with 2 Shellys in hand, I knew that we had other ways out. I was successful in buffing my Nami to keep it out of range of my opponent's heavy removal, which proved crucial later on. Despite having her damage for most of the match, I took advantage of the fact that they didn't have units to block with, combined with my double Shelly tech, one of which had grown to be a world-ending threat on his own, and finished them off on turn 8. Game number 4 was against... Alright, stop me if you've heard this one before. Like, actually, please just fucking shoot me. I'm not irritated at this deck because it was once good or because players like this individual genuinely enjoy it. I'm more irritated by it because it's hard to make commentary on. Without knowing the possibilities of the deck in loosely exact terms, it's easier to see when it fails in a massive way rather than being able to praise it or lift myself up for playing around a specific playstyle or mechanic. If Song Spinner or even Seraphine herself hits the nuts, it's expected and a bit of an eye roller. If it whiffs hard, and therefore I can't tell if I'm winning because I'm a good player or because some RNG happened to go against my opponent. What I do know is that I got hit with every copy of Ravenous Flock, 2 drum solos, a high note, whiffed on the jailbreak that was created by the homie coral creatures, and because my opponent didn't wait for me to play a response spell on this final attack, they completely messed up their syncopation that they got from the Song Spinner. Do I feel good about winning? Well, heck yeah, this was the game that got me into Platinum again. Did I feel good about that game, though? Absolutely not. To round out the series of events, I played one more customary game to see if I could start climbing in Platinum, and well, what do you know? Seraphine's back at it again. Of all the games that I have played on this deck so far though, this was the one that felt the most stacked against me. Never mind the previous losses we had because ouch my Nexus, this one was a genuinely terrifying matchup. My opening hand was great though. Having Fizz and a burst speed spell is always a good option to guarantee some damage, while the Piltover Castaway plus Fleet Admiral Shelley activates the rest of the deck just by appearing on board. On turn 4, I had an attack with the Castaway that couldn't be blocked by Acorn and would certainly kill Victor. My reward was a Mystic Shot. This let me move the equipment onto Fizz, which meant that I was free to block Acorn for the foreseeable future. The Mirai Songstress even further helped this cause and supplemented some more elusive damage on their own, further compounded by the Darkman Harpoon. But then on turn 7, Glorious Evolution was played and I knew I was in for a rough time. This invalidated the tough keyword that I had on my Fizz and reduced any created cards that my opponent came across by 2 thanks to Victor leveling up shortly afterwards. What I did was play the copy of Bilgewater Tellstones I received from Coral Creatures, used it to create a Chum the Waters to grant one of the Acorns vulnerable, and for an emergency blocker against Victor, which had gotten massive at this point. At the very end of the game, my opposition used Bone Skewer, which is apparently a 1x main deck card, to try and deny me a win. However, unfortunate for them, I had another copy of Fizz in my hand and used it to rally. They played a back alley bar, which made my heart skip a beat, but it didn't seem to generate anything useful as I was finally rewarded with the victory screen. And now I know what you're thinking, wow Kai, you're such a hypocrite for hating Demacia, but you won with rally and scout effects at least 3 times in this video. But you gotta understand man, I'm trying to feed my family. And by my family, I mean my ego, and by feed, I mean cheap LP at a low price of $3.99. That's right, baby, I regret nothing! Between my 2 play sessions, I won 8 games and only lost 2, both of which were absolutely winnable if I stopped to warm up the bowl of cream of wheat. We faced 8 decks featuring Noxus and won 6 of those matchups, 3 of those victories of which were Ezreal and Seraphine. I'm not sure if it was the power of the deck itself or the fact that we were in the no man's land known as gold, where the points are made up and the knowledge on weird niche decks is next to none, but this did feel pretty good to play. Maybe if I face Teemo Zoe at some point in the future I'll be singing a different tune, but as far as my Runeterra AR match history is concerned, I'll keep on singing the blues.